Good morning to all. After transatlantic relations, it's only natural that we now turn to the future of European security. I am Sylvie Kauffman. I'm a foreign affairs columnist with the French newspaper Le Monde, and it's my great pleasure to welcome to this panel on the future of European security. On my right now, Tyyne Karjalainen. I'm
That's
terribly
perfect.
sorry.
That's perfect.
I've been rehearsing, but yeah. And Tyyne is a research fellow at FIIA here. Max Bergmann, who crossed the Atlantic to be with us, and he's the director of the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program at CSIS in Washington, D.C. And Barbara Kunz, who is the director of European Security Program at SIPRI in Stockholm. And unfortunately, Charles Powell couldn't join us this morning. So, as you know, in France we have a president who thinks and talks a lot about European security, to the point of irritating some of his partners sometimes. And over the past couple of months, he's been he had to focus on the somehow chaotic domestic political situation, but now, having Michel Barnier as Prime Minister in charge of the government, he's free again to focus on European security. So last Sunday, he met with the community of the Sant'Egidio community, and he gave a speech where he called for imagination. He said imagination is indispensable to bring about a new form of peace in Europe. We will have to think of another form of organization of Europe and to rethink our relationship with Russia, he said. So let's summon our imagination capacity here today, but before we do that, I would like us to have a look at how we got into the security crisis that we're in now, with war raging again in the heart of Europe. So, Tyyne, I will turn to you first. You wrote an essay with Mina Alander, where you said, you specifically wrote that the pre-war security order enabled Russia's aggression in Ukraine. In what way? Could you elaborate on this a little bit, please?
Okay, maybe 2 points that I want to make. The first one concerns accountability, and I think this is something you have all heard many times already during the war, how the lack of accountability for previous breaches of international law by Russia, we could not hold Russia accountable, right? So we all know Russia is accountable for this war, it was accountable for the previous violations, but we could not hold it accountable. And if we look into European security architecture, we don't have tools for holding Russia accountable, right? Like we have, for instance, OSCE, it can help to monitor a ceasefire agreement in a very local context and hold parties accountable for implementing that deal. But when it comes to regional powers, what Russia is in Europe, we don't have tools for that in Europe. And we are relying, of course, on the international infrastructure for justice, the UN system, which has some tools, but again, also that infrastructure, that system does not have tools for holding great powers and their state leaders accountable. So this is the starting point. This is the core of the problem, right? But at the same time, then we have been trying to circumvent this challenge of lack of accountability by preventing the violations in the first place, right? If we cannot hold violators accountable, we need to prevent the violations. And how we have been trying to prevent violations has been through economic dependency, right? Mm-hmm. Through deterrence. And it has worked quite okay for the centers of powers, right? For Germany, for France, for Russia, there's no major war between these centers. But this deterrence, this prevention through dependence, economic dependence, only worked for the centers of powers and not for the peripheries. Mm-hmm. And this is why Finland now applied to NATO, right? We cannot be in the periphery that is not protected by the system. And this is why Ukraine is applying for a NATO membership, right? And it's not only that this coverage of deterrence or this economic dependency did not reach Ukraine. Actually, there was more a bargain in between protecting these centers and not protecting the peripheries. So, and I'm now referring to choices such as that after 2014 annexation of Crimea, we did not start supporting Ukraine, capacity building Ukraine, because we prioritized the status quo between the centers.
So that's the gray zone, the problem of the gray zone, yes. One housekeeping thing, if you, I will turn to the audience to questions later on, but if you feel like you want to interrupt, please do, if you want to react on anything which is said before the end of this session. Well, Barbara, please, how do you assess the reactions once this whole system failed and the crisis erupted in the gray zone? How do you judge the way European actors reacted, the sanctions compared to previous crises, for instance, compared to 2014? And if you could also focus on the particular reaction in Germany, the Zeitenwende, which was really a huge event when it happened 2 days or 3 days, I think, after February 24, 2022. I mean, this was really a major stand taken and decision taken by the German Chancellor. Where does Germany stand now? Please.
Okay, if I may, maybe let me start with the beginning of the question, because I would actually like to question the assessment that the security architecture failed or that the structure failed. I think that's overestimating the power of structure. Structures are not actors. Actors cause wars. And so that is something I think that deserves more discussion. But when it comes to the reaction to what happened, I think we need to look at two different levels there in general. I mean, the European unity and so on was a positive thing, and it's also good to see that the unity more or less, I would say, still prevails on many things. But I think when it comes to sort of the more long-term reactions to the question of how do we deal with a revisionist state, that is how I would phrase it, you know, and also not say that the problem is the structure or so on. I think the European security order actually is the right order in the sense that it's based on territorial integrity and the respect of sovereignty and so on. And so the problem is not this order. The problem is that there is one big revisionist state that doesn't want to respect this order. And so the question is, how do we deal with that? And of course, in the short term, measures like sanctions and so on are the question. But I think in the long term, and also based on the idea that since there is no accountability, and I don't think there will be any accountability, because that is the age-old problem of international politics, that there is no world government that could enforce accountability, we need other means. And I think in the face of a revisionist state, this mean is going to be mostly deterrence, and hopefully some reassurance sprinkled in too, to make sure that the situation does not escalate. And so there, two things are necessary in the reaction. You need an intellectual reaction, sort of a conceptual reaction of how do we deal with this, what to some in Europe is the new world, to some it's the very old world. And we have sort of the more material discussion about the capabilities and beefing up the militaries and so on and so forth. And I think we're making moderate progress on the material side with beefing up military capabilities across the continent. I think we still have a long way to go on the intellectual side and how to read this, how to interpret this, and how to draw a conclusion from this. Now, when it comes to Germany, and I mean, I look at Germany from quite some distance. You know, I don't live in Germany. I'm not really a part of the German debate, but I think Zeitenwende was, to use a German word, sort of a straw fire. You know, it burned up. And that was a little bit to be expected, I think, for most Germany watchers, because there have been this burst of Germany promising to do more in the past. The question was, is this now going to be...
But not to that extent.
Not to that extent. But I think if you look at it now, with some time that has passed since February 22, you can see that the determining factor in German defense policy is still not threat perception. And that is the answer, I think, to your question. So there will be things, but I think a lot of this in the German debate is about the budget, as I think we all follow, but there's also issues like Germany wants to be a good ally. It is increasingly lost on what exactly that means. But again, the determining factor in German defense policies is not threat perception. And as long as that does not change, I do not think that we will see, that the rest of Europe will see the Germany it likes to see.
Max, this threat perception issue is very important. It was actually addressed in a way in the previous panel. In the US, the threat perception is definitely very different. I mean, it is different in this part of Europe and in the western part of Europe, but in the US it's even more different. And we heard from that the American public mostly didn't really care about what was going on in Ukraine as long as there are no American servicemen involved, right? So is this, before we go to specifically to the future of American security, on this present situation and what caused this crisis to happen, does the US have a responsibility in this? I mean, is there, the fact that Washington was withdrawing in a way and focusing on China, withdrawing from engagement in the world and in Europe and focusing more on China. Has this been a factor in this crisis, you think, or is it only the Germans and the French fault?
It's a tough question. When I think back to the beginning of the Biden administration of 2021, I do think it was pretty clear that U.S. foreign policy was shifting towards China, and I think that broader trend has continued. And I think that may have been a factor in Putin's calculation about what the U.S. would and would not do if Russia were to invade. If you remember back to June 2021, that's when Biden and Putin met, and it was sort of a continuation of a tradition that American presidents since the end of the Cold War have done, which is to try to reset relations with Russia. And in this case, the idea was to have a stable and predictable relationship, to park Russia to the side so we could sort of focus on China. And I think, Putin got so much wrong in his assumptions in deciding to invade. I mean, he thought it was going to be very quick. He thought the Ukrainians weren't going to fight. But I think in part of that, and that was the major misjudgment that I think he made, I think he also misjudged how the United States would respond. So I would sort of quibble a bit with your how you posed it, where I think in 2022 in particular, the U.S. public and the U.S. government, I think, reacted in shock and horror at what Russia had done. And the U.S. government did things that, frankly, I didn't think were actually possible, having worked on the kind of arms sales and security assistance portfolio before. The sort of technology that we would never transfer to Ukrainian military that was, frankly, infiltrated and compromised by Russian intelligence in terms of technology loss, things that we, would keep a threshold on the sort of high-tech things we would transfer, and we just broke all those rules effectively in 2022 because of what Russia did. But then, for the United States, we're far from this conflict. The American public is sort of far from this conflict. The American public has spent 20 years at war. And I've looked at, there's been, because we have a presidential election, there's lots of polling, and some of the polling looks at American public opinion when it comes to foreign policy. And the good news is that there's strong support for Ukraine. I think the bad news, and I think this is what the Ukrainians are really misjudging the American political mood sometimes, is that the American public also does not want to be engaged at all in any foreign conflict. There is an isolationist mood that that Trump is tapping into, in part because we've been at war for between 2001 and 2021. And so if the kind of spectrum shifts there, where U.S. support for Ukraine moves toward U.S. active involvement in a conflict that could engage with Russia, that's where there is a political challenge. And when we think about the war in Ukraine, the Biden administration is getting a lot of heat. The president is getting a lot of heat from the Ukrainians, and some of it is, I think, fully deserved. But there's no prominent American politician to the right or that is more hawkish than Joe Biden on Ukraine. And the debate in the United States, and you hear Donald Trump saying this, is Donald Trump is introducing the threat of nuclear escalation, and that support for Ukraine will draw us in. So the political dynamic is very different, I think, in the United States than it is in Europe, in part because Europe is distant. Europe is so close, and we're somewhat distant. In the U.S., there's constantly crises in the world that we are always somehow have a role in. And so this is now kind of your Ukraine in the U.S. public's mind is sort of this background noise of, or that's maybe it's not the right way to put it, but it's part of the news, but not necessarily a core part of what Americans are thinking about. And where the U.S. government is really shifting continues to be this sort of intense focus on the Indo-Pacific. And I think that represents something that's very different than the Cold War period, where NATO is sort of back to its Cold War focus, but we're not focused on Russia the same way that we were the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm. And let me stay with you for a minute. If there were to be a negotiation to end the war in Ukraine, would there be a seat for the Europeans at the negotiating table, or would the Americans would do it directly with the Russians, as they used to do?
I think it's a very good question. When I think about a future Trump administration, and we were talking about this in the before, I don't think there's I don't understand why Putin would negotiate with Trump over Ukraine, because the U.S. support for Ukraine, if Trump wins, I think is inevitably going to collapse. I just don't see how Trump, early in his administration, goes to Congress and asks for $60 billion. And I don't see Congress approving that. So if you're Putin, we just ran a grand experiment of what happens if the U.S. stops providing support to Ukraine.
And you don't see the Europeans picking up the...
Well, I mean, it's already... The problem for Europe, and something we can maybe get to, I think the next panel may get to this, is that the defense industrial ramp-up has not happened. Yeah. So there's not an ability to backfill the United States. So I don't think Putin negotiates with Trump over Ukraine because I think he can win over Ukraine. I think what Putin would look to, what he might be interested in, is a negotiation, if we think back to the letter that he sent to the administration in December 2021, laying out sort of all these sort of maximalist Russian terms, basically NATO pulling back to its 1997 borders. I think that's something Trump would be willing to entertain. I think that's something Putin would be very excited to discuss. So I think when I think about a future negotiation, that is the United States negotiating over the head of Europeans. I think if you have a Harris administration, I think it would be much more inclusive, though not completely, especially on the nuclear dimension.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if I may comment on that, of course, the background is that the previous negotiations took place in Normandy format between Moscow, Kiev, Paris, and Berlin, right? And we did not see amazing results either, so it's not that European peace broker will come up with a great solution. What is more important, I don't think it is whether it is Washington or Paris or actually Peking leading the negotiations. The key is whether there is actually any peace broker in this world that could come up with a solution that would sustain. And this is the key challenge, that there is no such authority. It is very hard to imagine a peace deal that would actually guarantee a sustainable peace in Ukraine. And this is the key challenge, right? And there are many other layers as well. But this is the previous experience that we have had, that any that kind of deals don't usually hold.
Barbara, yeah, so we need a new security order, I guess, right? Because But of course, why would the Europeans be so interested in what could look like a peace deal? Or it's because this would determine how we deal with Russia in the future. So, what is your what is your view? Do we have to invent a new structure, or do we have to fine-tune the existing one? I mean, is it enough to, for instance, to extend an invitation to NATO, which is not happening so far? What do you think?
Well, first of all, I think a new security order, the war in Ukraine will not end with some type of Congress of Vienna where we will rethink the European security order. I think the same way the current security order has emerged, it's just it happened somehow after the end of the Cold War. And I honestly think that this is how things will continue, because this is how things usually go on. I would also, as I said earlier, I would actually reject the notion that the current security order is wrong. I mean, this is a very underdefined term, right? So a lot of people talk about security architecture, they talk about security order. It's never really defined. Sometimes people use it interchangeably and so on. To me, the architecture would actually be the institutional settings, and the order is more broadly about the rules all of this is based on. And I mean, the key rules we have in Europe are set forth in the Paris Charter. And I'm very happy with the Paris Charter, in the sense that this is the rules the European security order should be built upon.
Except that it's not really implemented.
No, but to use a very simplistic analogy, killing people is illegal. Murders still happen. Mm-hmm. Is that a reason to change the laws on murders, or is it rather that we need to think about how to better enforce these laws and deter people from killing other people? I think this is the debate we need to have, because to me it seems completely unrealistic also that we will sit down around a table and invent a new security order. So I think it's the current one that needs to be the basis, and I also think it's actually not that bad. Now, the question about Ukraine and NATO is not about changing the security order necessarily. It's about expanding membership in institutions that are elements of this order, or this architecture. And there I think, what will be crucial, as was already said yesterday, is security guarantees for Ukraine. Now, the adjective that is usually missing in all these debates is credible. Because in my opinion, non-credible security guarantees are actually more dangerous than no security guarantees.
But do you have other credible security guarantees than Article 5 at the moment in our system?
Well,
I mean, this is a question for all of you, actually.
Yeah. I think we can imagine, what the President was saying yesterday was that we would move forward, was it the EU first, then bilateral agreements, then NATO. I would add the concept of kind of coalition of willing here, and this kind of group of states providing security guarantees for Ukraine before we can actually take Ukraine in NATO. And I think actually having the EU membership first might not be a good idea, since that will take time, or it's a big challenge. But if I may comment on what you said, I think one more perspective that we need to keep in mind when discussing security architecture is that it is a tool, right? It is not the end state. And this was maybe the thing I wanted to say already yesterday, listening to discussions about total defense, that it's a tool. And in order to use this tool, in order to develop this tool, we need to have a clear idea what are the objectives, right? What are the prioritized objectives? Because there are many objectives. The security architecture is supposed to protect the European states, the citizens, the economies in Europe, but I guess also democracy, some of our values. And now I'm coming back to the peace talk question, because if we think that it is the European economies that these talks or a security architecture should protect, then maybe we should enter the peace talks. Who knows if the economy is the key objective, because maybe a quick deal would help to restart the trade with Russia. But then if the fundamental objective is to protect democracy in Europe or peace in long term, also it's a question of time frame, then we need some other kind of solutions.
But in our system, or in the institutional system we have, the EU is not supposed to be a security organization. If we follow this pattern that first we enlarge EU and then we enlarge NATO, which, okay, is a matter for discussion, but then EU would have also to fulfill a security role in a way, right? Do you see this happening, Max and Barbara?
Well, I think when I think about the future of the kind of European security order, and this goes back in part to my earlier comment about the U.S. kind of focus on the Indo-Pacific, despite the fact that there's a war on Europe, and so NATO is back to its Cold War posture. But I think this sort of concept of a European pillar of NATO, I don't really see that forming without the EU. And there is Article 42.7, where the EU kind of, it's not as robust, obviously, as Article 5. But, and you know, for the last 30 years, there has been this kind of concept of a common foreign security policy. It hasn't really been
Yes.
concept.
Yeah.
You know, there are EU military missions. They haven't really, you know, been implemented. But I think what this war has exposed is that NATO has fundamentally failed in a core aspect, and that is on the defense industrial side. And because it's just not equipped to that. It's a multilateral organization, and there's competing defense industries. It doesn't have a large budget. And there is a real role for the EU to play in defense that is not, you know, undermining NATO. If anything, is really strengthening it. And I also think that one of the core challenges is that when we think about a European pillar, is that the European defense integration is something that has not happened over the last 25 years. In part, it's because the United States has vehemently opposed it. And I think what you've seen actually during the Biden administration since this war is a softening of that. The United States did not speak out against Kaja Kallas when she was pushing for Eurobonds or the EU ammunition proposal. Instead, that was seen as, okay, that, you know, may not be great for our defense companies, but our defense companies currently can't meet the orders that are being put on them, that there's a general capacity challenge. So I think when I think about the future of the European security architecture or security order, I think there's a much stronger role for the EU to play, maybe not in a EU army, but in trying to make sure that begin this long slog of European defense integration, and where Europe then can sort of act more as Europe, as opposed to now where Europe really can't act without us. And I think that is a fundamental deficiency in how we're currently structured.
Yeah, well, Kaja Kallas may make this proposal about Eurobonds for defense, but Poland is placing all its orders in America and South Korea, so not in Europe. So, I mean, the dynamic is also continuing there. So, Barbara, what is your view about this creation of the new defense commissioner in the EU? Do you have any hope in this, or how do you see this?
Well, I mean, overall, I completely agree with Max, and I would see the European Defense Commissioner sort of within that framework and as one tiny step in trying to reach the objective that you just described, Max. And so hopefully this defense commissioner can actually play a role in this. The thing is also that more European defense industrial cooperation, that would be good. We've known that for many, many years, but then countries have reasons or think they have reasons to not work towards that goal, as you also just mentioned with Poland. So I mean, in a way, these are really the age-old discussions in Europe that are not really that much different now than they were from 10 years ago. But I mean, if I were to be a little optimistic, if you think back at the early stages of the European strategic autonomy debates and the at times really stupid discussions we had about this, and this idea that it's either NATO or the EU instead of focusing on the complementarity, and this tendency to interpret sort of strategic autonomy as decoupling from the United States, which was never on the agenda in the first place. But I mean, nobody cared about this in the debate. I sometimes at least got the impression. Now, a lot of the proposals from 2016, 2017 are completely European mainstream. So, I mean, maybe not using the term European strategic autonomy because that remains somewhat poisoned, but the very ideas, and also this idea that US pivot to the Indo-Pacific might require Europeans to do more, all these arguments that were rejected pretty broadly across Europe back then are today part of every single mainstream debate. And so I think in that sense there is progress. Whether the defense commissioner is really going to be a big leap forward, I personally have some doubts, but I mean, it is worth trying, but this will ultimately be decided in national capitals, how seriously they really want to be about a European pillar. And so the EU can provide incentives, but not much more than that, I think.
So we're back to political will, right? Yeah. Before I turn to you, Max, I have another question for you about Trump. I know this was discussed a lot in the previous panel, but what is your view about what would happen to Ukraine if Trump was re-elected?
So I don't think it's
and to our security.
Yeah, I don't think it's a pretty picture in Ukraine. I think the only real, the way I see it, and there's, I could totally be wrong. Predicting how Trump what he will do is incredibly difficult. The only political hesitation I see from Trump to not pull back funding is that if by pulling back funding, you kind of have a recreation of what we saw in Afghanistan in 2021, Vietnam in 1975, of a total collapse that isn't a political problem for Trump. But that said, he's not going to be running for re-election, presumably, because he's not allowed to. So how much would he care about that? So I tend to think the money is not going to continue to flow. And because of that, that is Ukraine's lifeline. Europeans are very quick to point out how much they've provided in terms of total dollar spent. And when we're, at times, I think many in America are very eager to highlight that as well, to demonstrate that Europe is doing its share, and I think that's right. But supporting Ukraine is going to be a lot harder going forward for Europeans because they've given away all their old stockpiles. So there isn't, Europeans didn't have a lot in the warehouses to begin with, and now that's gone. So everything going forward has to be bought. And what I see right now is that Europe needed to take action a year ago, 2 years ago, to really ramp up its defense industrial production. What you see are a lot of national orders, so there has been some ramp up. But if right now you're a German arms manufacturer and you were thinking, man, do we really want to commit to open that third, fourth, fifth factory based on some potential demand? And then you see the German government, its adherence to its debt and deficit, ideology, cut funding for Ukraine. You think you made a good bet. So there hasn't been this big ramp up. There's been no EU supplemental. And so in some ways, I get sort of annoyed when the focus is on whether the US should allow Ukraine to use whatever few missiles that it has left from the United States and Europe to strike Russian territory. It's a very important discussion. But the major issue is how do we, is the industrial side of this war. And that's where Europe is not ready to fill the gap. So if Trump wins, I think Ukraine is in dire straits because the Europeans can't fill the gap because they haven't taken the action necessary to put themselves in the place. So in 2025, they're ready to step in if the U.S. steps back. And I think that's a huge problem, not just for Ukraine, but for European security.
So Trump cuts the funding. Does he also do a deal with Putin?
I mean, I think Trump would really want to win a Nobel Peace Prize, but I think his attention to detail, and also I think his team's willingness to really make this a major focus, that really want to focus on China. I see this as sort of a sporadic effort that doesn't quite go anywhere, and I don't see why he would negotiate when he can just wait and the money will go away and then Ukraine will be there for the taking. So unless there's some big carrot for Russia, I don't quite see any sort of Trump negotiated end to this war. And I don't see the Ukrainians going along with anything that really forces them into a situation where, in 3 years' time, there will just be sitting ducks for Russia. So I think it's a big problem.
So in terms of how Europe rethinks its relationship with Russia, if we have this scenario, for instance, what do we do? What do we have to do to now? That's the easy question for you.
What do we have to do with Russia, with the US scenario?
Yeah.
Well, I think maybe, well, of course, what has been said is totally right, and about the defense industry that will be discussed soon, it's good to remember that it's not only for this war, but it's also in order to guarantee the peace deal. Like we need to have stocks full also it's part of the deterrence, right? Also to support Ukraine, it's part of the security guarantee that we have our stocks full and Ukraine has the aid coming. In other ways, one thing about the European Union's role, I maybe wanted to say that the EU's role in the security architecture, it is, of course, about the developing capabilities. It is the European Union now has the European Peace Facility, for instance, which is a major step in comparison to what the EU has been before as civilian actor, as you said. But it's not only that. Like, you can pursue security, you need to do also other, like, in order to have security, it's not only security tools that you use, right? But the European Union's role to uphold European security is also to make sure that the other principles that we need to fight our internal threats for security, for instance, are there. The rule of law, the democracy, that we don't see these principles, for instance, backsliding in Europe. This is also a security issue, right? Where the European Union plays a role. But it's not to disagree what you said. It's just something in addition.
Barbara, do you have any idea of what Europe should, how would Europe behave if this scenario happens? And also, we were talking earlier about the beauty contest that may happen if Trump is re-elected, and who will be the first European leader to go to DC. Will there be a beauty contest with Putin as well?
I think that very much depends on the outcome of elections in various European countries, because it's, I think, important to also not lose sight of the fact that the Ukraine war is becoming increasingly politicized within European countries. Not all of them. I think the big difference between European countries today is you have countries with pro-Russian populists and you have countries with anti-Russian populists, and populists rising everywhere. So that is a factor, I think, that we need to keep in mind. But what should Europe do if the scenario arises? I hope that Europe would spend at least 5 minutes cursing itself for not preparing for this earlier, and preparation should have started 10, 15 years ago, but didn't. But that doesn't help in the future. And I think then what's happening happening in the medium to long-term future is the question, do we have means to do anything else but appeasement with Russia? Right? Because if we want to have options, we need to have the military strength to actually open up these options, or actually do something else. Otherwise, we without the Americans and the current state of European security, we're in dire straits. And I think there's not much nuance maybe in this assessment, unfortunately.
Max, and then if you have any questions, please prepare them.
Just one quick comment that, I do think that if there is a Harris administration, I do think it's very likely that there'll be another robust aid package for Ukraine that will have very strong bipartisan support. And then I think the question then is, what does Russia do? Because I think there is, I think the Ukrainians now are more open to negotiations and having what would be a ceasefire in this conflict due to their kind of intense exhaustion. And if you have a Harris administration and it's clear U.S. support's not going anywhere, perhaps there is a window for negotiation. One thing I would say there is I don't think it would lead to any sort of lasting agreement. And I think the key demand of the Ukrainians, of both the United States, or at least this is what if I were Ukraine, is that I would not agree to any peace agreement unless there are sort of a guarantee of funding that you can really build up your military forces, which then would mean huge outlays from both the United States and especially from Europe. So if, the illusion that if the war ends, then we can all just sort of go back and not fund Ukraine, I think is nonsense. So I think that is something that I think we have to reckon with. And if I was Ukraine, I would also want to accelerate membership in the EU in particular, and NATO they will ask for, and they have been, but the EU in particular. And this could be very tough, I think, particularly for the Europeans, and cause some really tough choices.
Yeah, but in terms of a deal, of course, it's good to remember that what Russia will require is limitations to the size of Ukrainian army, and Ukraine to abandon its bid for NATO and the EU. So it's really we are really far from that kind of outcome. So,
Are there any questions? Yes, a lot of them. Yes, please, here, and we can take two, yes. Just the next table afterwards. Yes, please, yeah, on the left. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, thank you, Sylvie. None of you mentioned OSCE as part of the European security architecture. So your take on the future of the OSCE. And I gather that some kind of a peace agreement will be expected sooner or later, sooner with Trump, later possibly if Harris wins. But who is going to implement it and monitor it? Ukraine and Russia, they have a long border. Troops stationed along that border. Is it the UN, the OSCE, Coalition of the Willing? What kind of mechanism does it require? Thank you.
Very good questions, yeah. Yeah, here, yeah.
Good morning, Jakob Algren. I'm director of the Swedish Institute of Industrial Affairs. Thank you for the discussion. I'd like you to comment on the discussion that is happening in Europe, mainly, I'd say, about the possible need of an independent European nuclear deterrent, especially in light of comments from presidential candidate Trump, etc. Thank you.
Okay, maybe we'll take these two and then we'll go back to you. So on OSCE, who wants? Yeah, Max, if you.
So I mean, I think right now, the OSCE is obviously very deadlocked. I guess the thing I would say is arms control is dead until it isn't. And I don't, would I predict that maybe there's, maybe there's a change in Moscow in leadership in 5 years, and then there's a potential to negotiate all sorts of things over the status of Crimea, or maybe what forces are allowed. You can imagine a scenario in which you very much need the OSCE to act as implementer of a potential agreement, a ceasefire, some of the roles that it was playing in 2014. So, we set up these institutions, and then to just say, oh, well, that's, they're completely dead because of our current situation, I think is sort of the wrong course. So I could definitely see a future role there.
Yeah, I don't think OSCE monitors, for instance, are very much welcome anymore in Ukraine. But that is not to say that OSCE cannot have some role in the future, and these kind of organizations, their relevance comes and goes, and then it comes back. In terms of peacekeeping or having a deal to implement them,
monitoring, yeah.
Yeah, I think we need to remember that Ukrainians actually asked for a peacekeeping mission already, like mid-2010s, and what they got was a monitoring mission and a civilian crisis management mission. So this is not a new idea, and I think that's something really to look into, whether we could have a UN peacekeeping operation if there ever is a deal to keep. At the same time, of course, our experience with peace operations is not only positive, and they come with many challenges. And contexts that have hosted peace operations for a long time do not develop as other contexts, because they are, of course, then relying on the international presence and become dependent on the international presence. So this is not just an easy solution, but something that then comes with new problems and challenges.
Mm-hmm. Barbara, I think the question about indefinite nuclear deterrent is for you.
That's a big question, of course. I think my short answer is no, because it's too complicated at this point. I really cannot imagine Europeans agreeing on anything regarding this, because I think what is often, and I mean, I of course follow these debates, also sort of the public version of these debates, and I think they are really, really lacking in complexity, because nuclear weapons is not just something you have, you know, that you put in your bookshelf and then it miraculously generates deterrence or something like that. But you really need to have a nuclear policy. You need to find a way to manage the security dilemma that invariably arises with your adversary if you decide to go that route. And I think this is extremely complex at a national level, and how this could be handled at a European level, I really do not see it. That said, there is an independent nuclear deterrent in Europe, and I'm not stressing that because I happen to be French. But I mean, so there is something that is there. Now the question, I think, is that is sort of lingering around Europe, and in many ways is sort of what would be the role of that for Europe. And I think there a lot of debaters in other European countries are getting ahead of themselves in the sense that they're debating a French offer, but to me, I don't see any French offer anywhere. I mean, I see an offer to sit down and have a conversation about strategic affairs, which is a good thing, but that's, I think, how far the offer goes. So in a sense, I think right now, this is more of a ghost debate that really moves the attention away from where it should be.
But is this conversation happening?
I think it's happening much more on Twitter and on think tank panels than in reality. But I'm, of course, not present when presidents have secret conversations.
I mean, I think
Max is present.
I think it's happening in sort of a general political space of, well, if the U.S. pulls back, we would need to replace what the U.S., the U.S. nuclear deterrent. The other thing I would just add is that the challenge is the decision making, right? So who in Europe would then authorize the launch, right? And so you have to have this sort of democratic legitimacy and uniform, yes. But I mean, this is what sort of one of the major challenges of creating a European defense community in the 1950s was that it would then suddenly leapfrogging, and you require having democratic political legitimacy to deploy the forces, whether that's an army or whether that's nuclear. So I think a European nuclear deterrent, maybe I'm for it, but I'm for it maybe perhaps in a sense of that would require the European political project, the EU, to become a de facto state. And that, is a...
We know that. More questions? I think there's one in the back there and one here on my right, and General Hodges third. Yeah, we'll do this. So one here, I'm sorry, I don't see very well in the back, but whoever has the mic now can take it. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Karen Anna Eggen. I'm a researcher at the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies. And I would first just like to thank you for a very insightful panel and interesting discussions and comments. So, and I think I would actually like to challenge you a bit on the question on negotiations and what the likely outcomes of the war is or are. Because there seems to be this very, this idea about the war will, if Russia were to be defeated, or it would look like Russia were to become defeated, we're facing either nuclear war or Third World War, or Russian collapse or civil war of some sort. To me, oftentimes, and even just from discussions we've had here, it's always this question of, both directly or indirectly, what will be the Ukrainian concessions at the end of the day? when we get to the negotiations table. And I would like to challenge you a bit on like thinking about what would be the realistic outcomes of a Russian defeat.
Okay.
Because I don't think it will be nuclear war or necessarily a Russian collapse. But I would like to hear your thoughts on this.
That's a very interesting question, yeah. There, yes, the gentleman over there, I'm sorry, I'm not very precise. And then we'll take the third question and we'll have to go quickly to the answers. Yeah, please.
Thank you. Miroslav from the Hybrid COE. I wanted to ask about another perspective of European security architecture, and that is how Europe is organized in confronting or counter the hybrid threats. And in particular, because it was mentioned that this disturbance of or fracturing the architecture has came because of neglecting the periphery. And I just wanted to ask, and the answer was, for example, in the examples of Finland and Sweden, that NATO has covered now this umbrella of deterrence. But what about the EU enlargement in terms of mentioning Moldova and particularly Western Balkan, where the hybrid narratives and fights are probably now the biggest? Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much. And Ben Hodges here in the front, please.
Thank you. My question is to Barbara. It's a nuclear question. I think that the reason Germany does not want to provide Taurus to Ukraine is because they're concerned in a Trump administration that Trump would pull back nuclear shield for Germany, and unlike France and UK, Germany would not have a nuclear deterrent. What is the solution for nuclear deterrence for a non-nuclear country like Germany?
Okay, easy question. If you want to start with this, Barbara, and we'll go in reverse.
My general take would be that the presence of these nuclear weapons in Germany and in the other extended deterrence countries is actually overstated in their relevance, and that sort of real nuclear protection for Europe does not necessarily happen through these very weapons, but that it's sort of embedded in, again, the credibility of US security guarantees to Europe. And credibility, I think, is really the key point here, which would be endangered with Trump in the White House anyway. So I think if Germany, as a non-nuclear country, decides that it wants nuclear protection, the answer is staying in NATO and contributing to NATO. I think this is really the answer. If I may just say, like, a very few words about the question of Russian defeat, because what I sometimes think is useful is to remind ourselves that we ultimately do not really know Russia's war objectives. We have a lot of theories of why Russia started this war and what they want out of it and so on. But sort of if we really take a step back from a purely analytical statement, we don't know for sure what they want there and why they do this. I mean, they say things and people in Europe say things, what they think, Putin thinks and so on, but ultimately we don't know. And so that also means that we don't really know sort of at what point Russia would actually fail to achieve its war objectives and what that means. Now, my theory about all of this is that for Russia, this is really systemic and much more than about Ukraine. And so if there is any kind of ceasefire in Ukraine, the problem with Russia, to put it very, very simply, will not be over, and that we need to think about these more systemic and structural factors.
So we are back to this issue of how do we deal with Russia in the future. You want both of you, Max and Tyyne. Max, start, please, to answer. Very little time left.
Yeah, maybe on the first question on Russian defeat. So I think one of the problems with negotiations and the concept of negotiations in this conflict is neither side is either, for negotiations, sort of both sides, I think, have to want the fighting to stop. And so sometimes the Ukrainians are on top, sometimes the Russians are on top. And, there was, I think, a moment in maybe December, early spring of this year, December of last year, where the Ukrainian counteroffensive had not succeeded. It was unclear whether U.S. funding was going to come good. And there, if the Russians had sort of said, okay, we can sort of freeze this conflict and let's talk with the Ukrainians, I think that might have been a moment where the Ukrainians would have said yes, but the Russians didn't do that. So the way I see it is, I think Ukraine, in order to bring Russia to the table, has to put Russia militarily on the back foot, where the Russians have to be, losing the war. And then the question is for Ukraine, well, if Russia's losing, why would you enter negotiations? And perhaps there is a moment where the Ukrainians feel like, well, they can actually pin Russia back enough, or they've regained territory, or they're content. And this is all going to be determined by the Ukrainians. And I don't think that's just rhetoric on the part of Washington. I mean, you see, the first panel talked about Israel-Gaza. I mean, the U.S. is engaged in, here, a lot of people think the U.S. has all this say over the Israelis, and it turns out, we don't. So the Ukrainians will dictate that. But there could be a moment where there is a point where Russia wants to negotiate, but I think that only happens if Ukraine is militarily on the front foot. And that is the key challenge, is how do we get Ukraine back on the front foot? And maybe just quickly on the hybrid threats. I think one of the key challenges here is that we've lost a degree of deterrence vis-a-vis Russia, in part because we have thrown all our sanctions at the wall, I mean, except for energy, which I think is potentially a big deal, and could be something on the table for the U.S. after the election. But we don't really have our sanctions toolkit. We can't really evict any more, Russian diplomats from embassies. So what is to deter Russia from attempting assassinations against heads of European defense companies? And this is where it gets a little tricky with Ukraine, because the one area where we have some leverage to deter or to cause real harm is vis-a-vis Ukraine, to do more in Ukraine. But then the question is, why aren't we doing that already? And so that's where I think there is some tension about, well, you can constantly escalate, but do you want to use that escalation as a threat in a form of deterrence vis-a-vis hybrid? And we haven't really had the kind of deep conversation there, in part because it's not great for Ukraine that we would be holding anything back because we want to send a signal of deterrence. But that's really the only mechanism that I think we have to impose real costs on the Russians should they take certain actions against us.
Tyyne, you'll have the last word.
I'll be quick. Firstly, about the hybrid threats, and we have, Moldova was mentioned by you, so we have, the EU PM in Moldova to fight, or help to fight the hybrid threats, and this really on the agenda. But there I would be really careful with the time frame. Are we fighting hybrid threats in short term or actually in long term? Because there are different priorities. If we want to counter Russian disinformation and all kind of undermining effect on democracies in long term, we need to be a bit more careful than just like closing media space, right? Because then we also lose diversity of democracies in these neighborhoods. About the victory question, I just want to, my analysis is that we have actually focused quite a lot on understanding Russia and its objectives, and I think we know them quite well in terms of Ukraine. It's to control Kyiv. It's nothing to do with territory. It's to control Kyiv and to prevent its integration in the West, because this helps Russia to get this kind of imperial status that is pursuing, right? This is and at the same time, while I think this is what we discuss every week in some media outlets in Europe, what are the Russian objectives and interests and red lines, at the same time, do we discuss what is the Ukrainian perspective on peace, how Ukrainians understand the victory or peace? Not that much, and I think this is really crucial, where we should look into also to facilitate the peace talks, because it's not so simple either. They also have a very nuanced priorities, and I think that's something where I would look into next.
That's a very good last word. Thank you very much to our panelists, and thank you.